folks, welcome back. Learning Unit 3. We're going to be focusing on Charles Bent and the Spanish identification in Chapter 5, as well as the Camp Grant massacre and the theme of intermarriage in Chapter 6. And actually, the theme of intermarriage is something that is also connected to Chapter 5. So that's going to be weaved through. Let's begin with Charles Bent. Charles Bent is a really interesting character. He is a Euro-American man who wanted to become a prominent individual in New Mexico. So in order to do so, he married a wealthy Mexicana and utilized her influence to basically climb the political ladder. And he also happened to be somebody who was interested in making New Mexico sovereign or independent from the Mexican state. So at the time, New Mexico was still connected to or owned by, if you will, Mexico. And so he's scheming, if you will, to make New Mexico independent, and then again, similar to Texas, maybe join the American Union. Now, he ends up getting killed by folks of Mexican heritage and folks of Native American heritage, and the retaliation with regards to the people that killed him or were perceived to kill him was definitely, I'm not suggesting that we're justifying the death of an individual, but the retaliation was the killing of way more people over Charles Bent. But because Charles Bent happened to be Euro-American and happened to be a very powerful individual within New Mexico, well then, these are the times that a lot of crime and a lot of violence were happening. So that is Charles Bent, really interesting person. New Mexico also had a situation that is argued to be developed from their disconnect, if you will, from Mexico. So the argument is that they tended to be a lot more isolated in New Mexico from the rest of Mexico, based on that they're primarily a desert. So there wasn't a whole heck of a lot of interaction. And because they were isolated from the rest of Mexico, or the argument is that they're isolated from the rest of Mexico, a lot of the people in New Mexico before Euro-Americans, and I'm not talking about indigenous people, I'm talking about folks of Mexican heritage, actually claim their lineage to the original Spanish settlers, so or colonizers, better yet. And so folks would identify as Spanish instead of Mexican. And while some of them might be criollos, which means people of Spanish heritage born in the New World, some of them were of Mexican heritage, which generally means mestizo. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that every single person of Mexican heritage is mestizo, meaning of European and indigenous blood, but that tends to be the more popular or largest group of folks of Mexican heritage. So Spanish ID over the Mexican ID because of the connection to the original Spanish colonizers. And the other element of that identification is that they didn't want to be identified as Mexicano. So they're saying, no, we're European, right? We're of European heritage, European stock. And the reason that Spanish identity was embraced is that they noticed the discrimination against Mexicans on behalf of Euro-Americans, so they wanted to distance themselves and not be treated like the rest of the Mexicans, so make that disconnect between other Mexicanos, so that the Euro-Americans would treat them like Euro-Americans or folks of European heritage rather than folks of Mexican heritage. So that's interesting. So for those of you who are interested in the history of New Mexico, if you look at their census data, you'll notice that in their early history, Spanish surname was a popular group designation, as opposed to identifying somebody as Mexicano. Spanish surname tends to be really common, so just throwing that one out there. Okay, with regards to Chapter 6, Camp Grant Massacre, 1871. In this particular situation, we had folks that were of Euro-American heritage, folks of Mexican heritage, and even other indigenous folks, particularly the Tohono O'odham, that all got together to basically kill primarily Apache. And among the people that were killed were women and children. So it wasn't just Apache men, but rather a massacre of Apache people. And it's significant because this is one of the first times that we see cooperative efforts across racial and ethnic lines. So they're all unified against one particular group. And despite their unified efforts in a massacre, and not that I'm trying to celebrate that cooperation, it didn't last very long. I mean, yeah, they cooperated for this very horrible incident, but eventually Euro-Americans, Mexican folks, and Native American folks were having conflict amongst themselves, so it didn't really resolve anything, but at least it was an interesting historical situation in which these three groups came together to fight one particular group. At least not fight, but massacre one particular group. And the reason that the Apaches were targeted is that the Apaches were argued to have raided and taken from these other groups like Euro-Americans, Mexican folks, and even other folks of indigenous heritage kind of indiscriminately. And so this threat was cooperatively squashed, if you will. So that is the Camp Grant Massacre. And last but not least, the theme of intermarriage. So the theme of intermarriage actually has been discussed in Chapter 5, but it's also discussed in Chapter 6, and in Chapter 6 a little bit more in depth. So with Chapter 6, we're talking about the folks, Arizona elites, if you will, who happen to be of Mexican heritage, who often would deliberately choose, at least for the Mexican women, deliberately choose Euro-American men to marry with the understanding or the hope that the privileges that are extended to Euro-American folks would be extended to the people that they marry. So not only that, but the Arizona elites also thought of themselves as better than other folks of Mexican heritage. So, and it, again, similar to what happened in New Mexico to make that separation, they're like, no, we have money, we have this status, and we're not like the other ones, so that's why, you want to marry us, and then we want to make that separation. We're also trying to claim racial purity, kind of like how folks were invoking their Spanish heritage in Chapter 5 with New Mexico. So they were hoping that their social class would protect them from racial discrimination through intermarriage, but that wasn't always the case. And so intermarriage did exist between prominent Mexican women and Euro-American men, and then eventually that began to decline when the railroads were being constructed and expanded upon. More Euro-American women started to arrive to New Mexico and to Arizona and to other southwestern states. And so Euro-American men were like, it's been real, but we prefer to marry Euro-American women. And so intermarriage began to decline. But at one point in time, it was frequent, and it was very, very, very rare for a man of Mexican heritage to marry a Euro-American woman. So that was very, very infrequent. It was more along the lines of a prominent Mexican woman marrying a Euro-American man, and in a way it makes sense because patriarchy was very powerful in those times, and so anything that potentially belonged to her family, and if assuming there was no male heir, any kind of property that would potentially go to her from her Mexican family would be held in her husband's hands because women weren't allowed to own property at the time. So it's really, really interesting, the dynamics of intermarriage. So it's definitely racialized, it's definitely gendered, and it's definitely classed. And that's a interesting theme that Acuna picks up on in the Texas chapter, which is chapter 4, chapter 5, and the New Mexico chapter, chapter 6, the Arizona chapter, and eventually in chapter 7, which we'll talk about in our next video when we're talking about California. Alright folks, have an amazing day. I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.